Hello, folks. Welcome to another episode of Now Podcast. Today we will be talking about a very important country, a beautiful place with wonderful people. It's the 17th largest country in the world with 85 million citizens. Today we'll be speaking with a native of Iran. Babak. Babak has lived in the U.S. for about 7 years
Yes,
now,
that is
and he will be telling us more about his home country. Welcome back to Humanity Now podcast. How are you
Thanks for
today?
having me.
Good. First of all, can you please pronounce your full name for the audience?
Yes, my first name is Babak, and my last name is Hemmatian.
Yes, that's an awesome name. Okay. First of all, I would like can you please tell the audience a bit about yourself and what brought you to the U.S., including your studies at university?
Sure. I did my undergraduate studies back in Iran at University of Tehran, which is also my Tehran is also my hometown. And but I came here to the U.S. about 7 years ago for graduate school. I went to Brown University in Providence, Rhode Island, where I got a master's in computer science and a doctorate in cognitive science. And my research, broadly speaking, involves um, using modern methods from computer science to better study public discourse and specifically how people negotiate social narratives and try to persuade others to their opinion.
Awesome. Great. Well, let's start by telling the audience some facts about Iran for those that don't know. This is from Wikipedia, of course. Iran is a country in Western Asia. It is bordered to the west of Iraq and Turkey, to the northwest by Azerbaijan and Armenia, to the north by the Caspian Sea and Turkmenistan, to the east by Afghanistan and Pakistan, and to the south by the Gulf of Oman and the Persian Gulf. Iran covers an area of 636,000 square miles, making it the fourth largest country entirely in Asia and the second largest in Western Asia. Do you have any thoughts on that?
No, I think it's always helpful to locate the places that you'll be talking about. I would just add that Iran, at least during its periods of regional imperialism, uh, used to rule over a lot of those surrounding nations, uh, either directly or kind of having cultural influence over them. Um, and that has some ramifications both for the regional politics today, but it also means that there are very strong cultural ties between Iran and a lot of those surrounding countries.
Yeah, that brings me to the ethnic groups which are predominant in Iran. 61% Persian, 16% Azerbaijani, 10% Kurd, which I would like to talk about, 6% Lur, which I'm not sure, but 2% Turkmen, and 2 Balak, and 2 Arab, and 1% other. The
Baluch.
capital,
Uh,
Balu.
yeah.
Yeah. What group do you come from?
Um, I would say on my father's side, I would be Lor, which is which is actually kind of a quite close to Persian, but perhaps a bit closer to Elamites, as I'm sure we will discuss later on. On my mom's side, I'm closer again to Persian, so I would say in those demographics, I would be classified as Persian, like the
Yeah, well,
majority of Iranians.
that's a good mixture of people there. There's a lot of different types. And the capital city is Tehran, with a population of 7.8 million or 15 million, including the suburbs. That's where you grew up.
Yes, that's where I was born and grew up. It's
That's awesome.
yeah, it's a massive city and not not entirely planned like some of the other metropolises, uh, which can make its large size kind of a problem, with pollution and traffic and stuff like that.
Sure.
But I have very vivid memories of there.
Right. The religions of Iran, according to a 2002 survey by the World Values Survey, found that 96.6 of Iranians believe in Islam. On the other hand, another 2002 survey conducted online by an organization based outside of Iran found a much smaller percentage of Iranians identifying as Muslim at approximately 40%, and a significant fraction not identifying with any organized religion at all. So that's pretty interesting. I don't know why there's discrepancy between the two surveys, but maybe one's official and the other one is, like they say, an outside of the country organization, probably the CIA.
Yeah, well, I mean, I can tell you from the example of myself why there would be a difference. There is no the only official religious identities that you could have in your identification are those religions that are recognized by the current Iranian government as valid religions. And that would include things like Islam, like Zoroastrianism, like Christianity, like Judaism, uh, but atheism, for example, is not a category.
Hmm.
So as a result, for example, I'm not religious, and neither is my family, but we are officially Shia, according to the government's classifications. But if
Right.
you would ask us in a questionnaire, what do you actually believe in, then I would give you a different answer.
Sure. I had for many years that were Persian Jews, and they were wonderful people. And they told me that in Iran, they were only treated with respect by everybody. And I thought that was really interesting because in the West, we're giving this viewpoint of Iran being anti Judaism, when in fact, many Persian Jews that I met were happy living there. Um, for the most part. So that's interesting to note. Um, yeah, it says here that 32.2% of the country, according to the second um, survey, identifies. So Shia would be the primary Muslim sect, I guess you would call it.
Yes, yes, definitely the dominant religious identity in Iran among those who do have a religious identity would be Shia Islam.
Right. Cool. Well, now we're going to get into some of the history of Iran. Um, Iran has a very long history. It's the home to one of the world's oldest civilizations. Can you please tell the audience a little bit about that history?
Sure. The southwestern part of Iran near the Persian Gulf was part of the Fertile Crescent related to Mesopotamia. The same area that, for example, the Babylonian empires grew out of. And in the part that is currently southwestern Iran, a certain group of native people developed large cities and gained a lot of political influence called the Elamites, and their land was called Elam. And this, we were talking about, civilized cities in something on the order of like 6,500 years ago. So many millennia ago. And they were, to a significant extent, the regional competitors to the Akkadians, the Sumerians, and those other early empires that and city-states that had formed in modern Iraq. But later, the Assyrians, and this is about 2,700 years ago, the Assyrians conquered Elam and razed its cities to the ground. And that created a kind of political power vacuum, out of which what is called the ancient Persian Empire grew. Persians were initially these nomadic people from Central Asia who had moved and settled in Iran for hundreds of years, but they were culturally very influenced by this kind of Mesopotamian culture that was dominant in the area. But then they grew to be that large empire, the stories of which you see everywhere in modern media, usually in the context of Alexander or the Persian Wars with Greek city-states. That was followed by several other high-profile Iranic empires, which was the Parthian Empire, and then the Sassanid Empire before the country was conquered by Arab Muslims. And after that, it was ruled by a succession of foreign rulers, for the most part Mongolian or Turkic, until about 400 years ago, when it again, for a couple of centuries, gained kind of empire status under the Safavids. So this would be about 400 years ago. And the Safavids were native, but they were again followed by another Turkic dynasty until about 100 years ago, when the last monarchic dynasty started to rule Iran. And 40 years ago, that dynasty was overthrown and the Islamic Republic came to power. So that's a very quick overview of all of the, I would say, 6,500 years of the country's history.
That's excellent. Thank you very much. I was going to ask you more about the recent history. Growing up in the 80s, we heard a lot about Iran-Iraq war. And of course, we heard about the Iranian Revolution, the Islamic Revolution in Iran. So can you talk about that for a brief moment?
Yes. So what happened, I mean, in terms of the context of all of this, what happened was that what is now known as British Petroleum was created in Iran as, the Perso-British oil company. I mean, it had a kind of a different name, but same idea. So oil was first essentially industrialized and commodified in Iran, and that meant an increased interest by the British and later by the Americans to gain political influence in Iran. And the way that progressed was that there was this pretty popular elected politician, Mossadegh, who tried to nationalize oil during the reign of the very last monarch of Iran. And the British and the Americans staged a coup to reinstall the monarch as an autocrat. And following this coup, his rule became much more autocratic, and he became much more of a dictator. So much so that he created a one-party system and asked anybody who doesn't want to be member of that political party to leave the country. And the monarch was also totally out of touch with the public's opinions. And this meant a lot of opposition to him grew, on one hand, among the religious people through Islamist movements, but a lot of it was leftist movements, because Iran also had a long history of socialism. The Tudeh party, which means the party of the masses, was created about 100 years ago with the support of the Soviet Union in Iran. And leftist ideas had a lot of influence among the better educated people in the big cities. And then there were also a lot of nationalists who also disliked the autocratic ruling methods of the monarch. So what happened was there was kind of a grand coalition of all of these groups that formed to take the monarch down. And Khomeini, who was seen as a pretty moderate cleric who had been in exile for a very long time, he was seen as a charismatic figure that could bring them all together. And charismatic he was, although later he turned out to be not moderate at all. But what happened was there was a popular revolution, and the Shah was overthrown and he ran away from the country. But then when the revolutionaries won that battle, internal divisions grew. Initially, the country was envisioned to be more of a classic democratic country with certain religious figureheads that would embody the religious values. But then conflicts between, first, the leftists were pushed out of power by kind of a coalition of the nationalists and the Islamists. And then the nationalists were pushed out of power by the Islamists. And a lot of this kind of consolidation of power that came with brutal crackdowns and lots of people being executed and lots of social freedoms being taken away, a lot of this happened under the cover of wartime policy, because Iraq was really interested in the oil-rich parts of southwestern Iran, the same area that the Elamites, as I said, that ancient civilization grew out of. And Iraq under Saddam Hussein had a justification for attacking Iran in that region because both the Soviet Union and the United States were afraid of revolutionary ideas growing beyond Iran's borders. So they would have turned a blind eye. So Iraq invaded Iran, and the Islamists used that on one hand to create a lot of patriotic emotions among the people to go and fight for the revolution on the front lines, but at the same time to really crush all sorts of opposition. And that is what happened until the war ended in 1988. And this is just less than a couple of years before I was born. And the changes remained irreversible. So the system has, if anything, become more stringent in terms of the rules you have to obey to be part of the political system. Yeah, and also in terms of the laws that have been established.
Right. Well, we're going to switch and talk a little bit about Iran's economy. Iran is no slouch. It has a GDP of 1.2 trillion dollars. Excuse me. That's in 2020. That's a per capita income of 14,000, which isn't a lot considering all the wealth that's in Iran. But Iran is the 23rd largest economy in the world. Of Iran's main industries are, of course, oil, gas, and chemicals. Iran's oil and gas industry is the most active industry of the country. Iran has the largest reserves of oil and second largest reserves of gas in the world. Iran now produces a of manufactured commodities such as automobiles, electric appliances, telecommunications equipment, machinery, paper, rubber products, steel, food products, wood, leather products, textiles, and pharmaceuticals. So that tells me that the internal economy of Iran is pretty self-sufficient in a way, probably because a lot of the world is boycotting them. Is that correct?
Well, two different things. First of all, Iran was undergoing a long period of industrialization before the revolution happened. So it was well on its way to become a fully developed country, in a generation when the revolution happened. So a lot of that stuff was already in place. Like, the automobile industry was already flourishing. A lot of, the steel plants, a lot of the agriculture. But what happened was, after the revolution, a lot of those industries were nationalized. And once the sanctions happened, the more strategic ones were strengthened by the state, partly through money that was coming from oil and gas, exactly to make the economy more resilient to external pressure, and because there was no external access. And part of that. Part of those industries are propped up by tariff laws, I would say. For example, Iranian cars, in terms of quality, might not be able to compete with the leading brands around the world anymore. But through really heavy tariff on foreign cars, the domestic market for those cars is still propped up. But in certain other domains is more organic. Like for example, because of the U.S. sanctions, a lot of the digital apps and websites are not accessible from Iran, or you wouldn't be able to connect them to your bank account to pay for services. At the same time, Iran has a really high rate of university educated people, especially in the engineering and more STEM domains. And that means there is a lot of talent and, for example, programmers who can create domestic variants of global companies. So instead of Uber, you would end up having an Iranian version of Uber with this domestic code base.
Well, that's great. How would you describe the economy? Is it capitalist or is it national, kind of like a state capitalism? How would you describe it?
Um, yeah, it's a weird chimera, I would say. Um, on one hand, a, a, a lot of the major industries are owned either directly by the state, or even if they are privatized, they are controlled by these kind of front companies that are associated with the country's military. So, um, especially the more ideologically oriented part of the military apparatus, which is the in the West called the Revolutionary Guard. Uh, it, it controls about an estimated third of the economy in all of those major domains, and it's easy for it to beat competition because it works through these nonprofit foundations that don't have to pay taxes. So it can provide services much lower rate, other than the fact that it can just, strong arm other uh, entities out of a particular market. And as a result of that, even though over the past several decades there have been attempts at uh, towards privatization and kind of moving towards a hybrid uh, capitalist and state-controlled economy, um, the reality is that things are still really controlled by those politically in power, and to a significant extent, those uh, uh, those at the head of the military.
Okay, fair enough. Well, it's not fair, but can you please tell us about how? Can you please tell us about growing up in Iran?
Yeah, well, um, I would say lots of aspects of my life were more similar to living in any other major metropolitan area of the world than you might imagine. Um, but I I came from a relatively low income background family, even by Iranian standards. Um, so my access to a lot of resources was constrained. I grew up in a tiny apartment uh, in a family of five, but because Iran still has relatively robust social support systems. That means that there are serious ways for social mobility if you show particular skill in certain domains, like in your education. Because, for example, to go to the prestigious universities, which are public universities, you need to take this national college entrance exam, and your ranking in that national exam determines where you end up. And for healthcare, if you go to public hospitals, um, things are either free for a lot of chronic illnesses like cancer, uh, or they are almost free, heavily subsidized by the state. And these meant that things like illnesses, couldn't totally derail my life. As a result, I studied hard, and I ended up the very uh, among the highest ranking people in the national college entrance exam, and that opened up a lot of doors to me, which is why, uh, even while in the U.S., I'm still strongly in support of strengthening these types of social goods and social services, because uh, in my own case, I from my own case, I know that I wouldn't be here if it wasn't for those support systems. Yeah, but if there are particular aspects of that uh,
No, that's great.
growing up question that you would like me to talk to, I'd be happy to.
Okay, well, what is life like for the ordinary working class people?
Yeah, when there are different aspects to it. Well, the economy is currently definitely heavily battered by first the war, all of those sanctions, and then the later sanctions because of the nuclear program. And that means a lot of people struggle to make ends meet. And that's kind of the primary focus in people's minds. Um, and I would say that has gotten much worse since I left Iran, actually, because the price of staple goods has gone up massively.
Mm,
Um, and there's at the same time, people also have to deal with a highly corrupt bureaucratic system that has grown out of the government's paranoia, I would say, because for decades it has been uh, prioritizing loyalty to the system over competence. And as a result, a lot of the talent has left the country, and the talent that is in the country is not in positions of power, and corruption runs rampant. So that's another thing that people have to deal with every day. Um, as for social sources of repression, I think this is what Westerners think about the most, but that is not as important to Iranians, I would say, in general, as the more economic aspects, and also the uh, the existence of opportunity for growth, and for having good careers and lives. The social repression is more often a source of annoyance for especially the less religious, the more well off population of the cities, where things like, rules that forcibly enforce hijab on the non-religious women, or uh, rules on against partying, or against drinking alcohol. And the reason why I say those are more of a nuisance is because a lot of everyday Iranians, regardless of their backgrounds, actually still do a lot of these things. It's just
right.
that the government having made them illegal makes them more expensive to do, because, for example, you need to find contraband if you're gonna drink, um, but also it adds a measure of risk to it, right? Like you would still party, but if somebody calls the cops, the effect on your career would be greater, much greater than if you were partying in the U.S. and someone called the cops. Um,
Wow.
yeah. So, so I would say in these ways, those repressive social rules do affect and annoy a lot of people in Iran, but the most prominent thing on their minds is the economy and uh, their ability to survive, honestly.
Right. What's life like for the working people? Do they work like a normal 40 hours a week, or do they work more? I know that sounds like a
Um,
stupid question, but
yeah, I mean, it depends on the kind of job. So in terms of rules governing workers' rights, the official rules are quite similar to a lot of countries where there is good protection for workers. But at the same time, uh, there is a real repression and suppression of organized labor. And this is actually kind of a paradox of the revolution, because before the revolution, the monarch was really against organized labor, and one of the benefits of the revolution was that afterwards, uh, labor organizations flourished, and a lot of rights and support systems for workers were created. And this was partly because the revolution had incorporated a lot of leftist populist ideas. Um, but in more recent decades, and under the effect of sanctions, any kind of organized labor activity is considered kind of like political subversive act. And
wow.
it, yeah, the syndicates have been brutally suppressed. And as a result, the employers have more room to exploit people. And that's made worse by the fact that the unemployment rate is really high and the inflation is really high and the price of basic goods is crazy, which means a lot of workers would be willing to endure exploitation if it means they can uh, put food on the table.
Yeah, survive.
Yeah.
So let's talk a little bit about the social aspects of Iranian life. One example that I heard about, which I thought was fascinating, I don't know if this is still true or not, but that women, how do I put it, transgendered women are allowed to get operations and live in Iran pretty well. Have you heard about that?
Yeah. And I've had trans. I've had and do have trans friends from my time in Iran. Iran, uh, yeah, this might surprise a lot of Americans, but in terms of trans rights, it's actually ahead of quite ahead of the United States, and it has been for decades. And this is partly due to the brave activism work of certain trans pioneers who, right after the revolution, argued with the leader of the revolution, Khomeini, that about how trans rights should be supported, and not just from a social standpoint, but also from a religious standpoint, making religious arguments of
Right.
why um, transgender rights should be respected. And those arguments won over, and right now it is not at all a controversial issue. Uh, the uh, you know gender affirming surgeries are fully subsidized
Right, right.
by the state, and
That's
there
amazing.
are legal systems in place for changing um, for changing legal documents and stuff like that. Although I feel like some Westerners, when they see evidence like this that doesn't sit well with their stereotypes of a certain country, instead of questioning their stereotypes, they double down and say, "Oh, actually, it's because of how much they hate gay people that uh, transgender rights have developed so much," which I find quite ironic because homophobia regarding gay people also was introduced to Iran from the West about
Uh-huh.
100 years ago, and before that, the country was the opposite of homophobic. It was very open-minded towards same-sex relations, um, and yeah, and I just find these arguments grand, coming from some Western sources. Anyway,
Yeah,
that's a bit of a
yeah.
digression, but I would say that if someone were to visit Iran, they would see a lot of these types of surprising facts. Like I would say the country's legal and social landscape is a mosaic of more progressive and less progressive elements that would baffle people from the other parts of the world. Um, and this is just one example, one example area where um, the opinions are really progressive.
That's great. That leads me to my next question. Is there social divisions, and if so, what are they?
Uh, yeah, there definitely are. I would say the two major political forces since the revolution have been the reformists and the principalists, which you can consider conservatives in Iran. But the dichotomy relative to the United States kind of falls apart because the reformists are socially liberal in Iran and pro democracy, pro expanded individual rights and stuff like that, but more fiscally conservative. They are against, in general, social support plans and more like libertarians in the U.S. Um, but on the other hand, you have the principalists who are populist in terms of their economic beliefs. They are in favor of better support systems for the poor, but also at the same time more socially conservative and more religious. And there has been, as a result, also a kind of city and rural region division, where rural people who tend to be more religious and tend to be poorer uh, also tend to be more, more tend to provide a stronger support for principalists, while the major cities with the less religious, the more educated population tend to be uh, more in favor of the reformists. I mean, there used to be a clear divide between both of these groups and the leftists in Iran. Iran had a very thriving and powerful leftist movement, but uh, it isn't any longer really the case. I mean, I know a lot of leftists in Iran, but nothing is organized. It's more of a kind of personal opinion for people at this point, and that's because many leftists left the country after the power, uh, the conflict over power followed the revolution, and a lot of them are in Western countries now as political asylum seekers. But those of them who remained, thousands and thousands of them were executed, and the remainder were essentially forced into silence. And they paid hefty prices in their everyday life too. And I have a lot of these people in my family, including my dad, who were barred from lots of employment opportunities because they had some they had a political background with leftist associations that made them persona non grata uh, to a lot of institutions. So so that I would say that kind of organized leftist thought is kind of a thing of the past right now. It's mainly something that university students or better off citizens just discuss in cafes. Um, but the more important social division is between the more reform minded people and um, uh, the more conservative, but at the same time anti-imperialist and populist portions of the population. I would say there's a fourth group, which is the monarchists, who are usually have a strong nationalist tendencies and really revere the previous system, but those don't really have any base of support in Iran. Uh, those are mainly people who live either in the U.S. or elsewhere in the West, and had ties to the previous government and left after the revolution. They just have this nostalgia for the past.
Right. Are there any pro-democratic movements out in the open now in Iran?
Um, Usually, what has been the case over the past 40 something years is that every 10 years or so, there is a major pro democracy movement. Um, and then the government initially uh, tries to bear with it, but then the protests grow and grow and grow until there's a brutal crackdown, and a lot of people are killed and arrested, and then uh, the, the government tightens the news, meaning a lot of the previously acceptable political parties and factions get expelled from the range of acceptable politics, and social freedoms are reduced. And then 10 years later, something similar happens. 10 years later, something similar happens. And I mean, the latest round of serious protests was just a few years ago. And at this point, I would say a lot of the Iranian population has entered a state of learned helplessness, where there's a feeling that uh, these kinds of pro democracy movements do not work, do not end up making their lives easier, their communities more open, but they actually backfire. And so there's a sense of there's no point in political activity, it just makes things worse. So I would say the majority of people right now would consider themselves apolitical.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, but that doesn't mean they don't have opinions about what's going on. And these opinions
Sure.
for the vast majority of people, even regardless of how religious they are, is that the vast majority have a negative opinion.
Mm-hmm.
They don't view what's going on as positive, and it's hard to view it as positive. Like if you look at the everyday life of people, it it has definitely been taking a turn, many turns for the worse, in recent
Mm.
memory.
Sounds
Yeah,
like
I mean,
like
sorry, those who support the government, of course, say, well, all of these turns for the worse are the result of Western interference and like you know American attempts at hegemony. And I think to to, to some extent that is true, but that argument can only be taken too far. When people hear the same kind of, oh, it's not our fault, it's not our fault when everything falls apart. At some point, it becomes like a tired excuse for much of the population.
right. It sounds to me a bit like the state of things here in the United States, where the individual is pretty much feels helpless. They know things are wrong, but there's no real organized. There's not. I know it's not the same, but it feels the same here. It feels like there's just a lot of kind of, I don't know the right word for it, but anyways, yeah.
Yeah. I think it's similar in principle, but different in matter of degrees. Like
Sure.
I've been I've been active as an activist, political activist in the U.S. for a number of years now, even though I'm not even a citizen. Um, but the personal costs of political activism in the U.S. is not comparable to Iran. Like my father was, and this has been the case for 60 years longer, since the American engineered coup. My father was a political prisoner before the revolution for several years, and
Wow.
he he was imprisoned just because he gave out pamphlets, um, on the streets, leftist pamphlets,
Wow.
and he was tortured for years in prison, such
Oh, I'm
that
so sorry.
up until he passed away a few years ago, every night he would wake up with nightmares from
Oh,
those tortures. So so I think there's a still massive difference between the costs of political
sure.
actions in the US and in Iran. It wasn't always like that, but you know, it is what it is. But I think in terms of principle, you're right. There's a similar learned helplessness among the um, leftist activists in Iran and leftist activists in the US.
Right. I want to backpedal a little bit and talk about the Kurds in Iran, because we're very interested in Rojava and the experiment there in a different type of government. What's the Kurdish population like in Iran? Can you speak to that?
Yeah, well, Iran has a sizable Kurdish population, but it, it is a population that is significantly repressed by the government. And part of the reason is that there was a kind of war of independence that happened in Iranian Kurdistan during the Iran-Iraq War, where they were also supported by Iraq in trying to break away um, from Iran, not directly supported by Iraq, but Iraq definitely welcomed uh, that struggle for independence. And since then, they have been a kind of suspicious minority in the eyes of the government. Uh, and that's also because they have entirely their own separate identity. It is an Iranic identity because they are an Iranic people, Kurds, but they have their own language, they have their own clothing, they have their own customs, they have their own, um, you know, long history. And in terms of religion, also, they are mostly Sunni Muslims compared with the rest of Iran that is Shia Muslim. Um,
Mm-hmm.
so there are lots of reasons why they wouldn't want to be part of this polity. Um, at the same time, I would say the the repression has never been as extreme as some of the other places. Like they get to do their celebrations. They get to teach their language, in their public schools. Um, but they are partly blocked from lots of positions of power. At the same time, to answer more the question that you asked, I would say there's no longer really a very viable alternative political option that is being strongly pursued in Iranian Kurdistan, and that is partly the effect of that uprising that I mentioned being crushed during the Iran-Iraq War. And since then, there being really a strong, iron fist control of the Iranian central government there. There is uh, PKK, the Kurdistan Workers' Party, who's still from time to time tries to do some armed resistance with sporadic attacks on armed forces uh, near the Iraqi border, but nothing much happens. And for the most part, I would say the um, Kurdish population in Iran is kind of just it has its nationalistic ideas, but is more integrated into the population. My brother-in-law is Kurdish, and uh, the connection between our families is an example of how uh, they, they have just become one other part of the Iranian population. I feel like you couldn't say the same about any of the other Kurdistan regions because in Iraq they are autonomous. In Syria, Rojava is autonomous, and in Turkey they are heavily repressed. That their very identity is under attack to an extent that it isn't in Iran. But that is still not to say that they are not a repressed minority.
I have a stupid question. Is part of Kurdistan in Iran? No, right?
Yes, yes. Uh, Iran has its own Kurdistan. So Kurdistan, the kind of the ancestral Kurdish lands, they create a continuous geographical region that includes parts of Iran, Iraq, Syria, and Turkey. And they have been in that region ever since the Iranic tribes migrated thousands of years ago. But
Hmm.
they have usually been under the rule of different empires, right? For um, for perhaps 1500 years or so of their history under the rule of Iranian empires, but also for part of their history under other empires. Like, for example, those parts of Kurdistan that are in Turkey and Syria and Iraq were for several hundred years under the control of the Ottomans. Um, but yes, uh, Iran has Kurdistan region, and in fact, Kurds first settled in Iranian Kurdistan, and then migrated around to all of the other regional countries. And that's partly why culturally they're much closer to Persians, for example, than say Arabs or Turks. Like, their major yearly festival is Nowruz, which is like the Iranian New Year.
Mm, interesting. Okay, well, we're going to wrap it up with this final question. The goal of humanity now is humanity. And what can we do to help Iran and help unite humanity all together?
That's a very good question. I think what you have been doing, for example, for the past hour is one important piece, which is uh, to ask questions instead of assume things. Uh, I feel like Iranians are aware of how little the West knows about them, and they are more than willing to share information, but not if you assume that your stereotypes about them are correct, because they're more likely than not they are very far from the truth. So I would say don't make assumptions about what Iranians are like, because there is very little exposure to the environment in Iran among Westerners. Just ask questions instead. The other thing is support and facilitate normal contact and interaction between uh, Iranians and people elsewhere in the world. I think that's the most potent antidote to both the political gridlocks that we have and the more interpersonal gridlocks that we have. Like, the racism against Iranians that I've faced in the US since I came here. In lots of cases, very egregious, things that were hurled at me. Um, I think the best solution for that is for them to see people, see Iranians, uh, and in all of the varieties that we come in, right? Uh, I'm queer, I'm irreligious, you know, I'm a leftist. Not at all the idea that you would have of an Iranian if you haven't met one. And if you start meeting more Iranians, you would learn how simplistic the stereotypes are. And the third one I would say would be to support uh, those activists who are trying to normalize relations and trying to create these human interactions between Iran and the West. For example, back in 2017, I co-founded Brown War Watch, a student-led peace activist group at Brown University, which is still active and creating lots of events. Um, so support these kinds of groups that support the work of democracy. Support groups like the National Iranian American Council that is trying to normalize relations between Iranians and the population in the United States, because these kinds of activities can have a rippling effect. Every American vote that is moved away from supporting hawkish politicians uh, creates this possibility that somewhere down the road there could be proper reconciliation and better unity for all of humanity, as you mentioned.
Excellent. Thank you so much. That's a great way to end. I want to ask you to please tell the folks how they can follow you.
Sure thing. Yeah, feel free to follow me on Twitter. It's at Babak Hemmatian, just my first name and last name. And feel free to message me there. I will be soon adding additional information to my Twitter account that connects to my academic profiles and uh, other resources. So that way, we can also follow my research into how we can try to bring people together.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Thank you for watching, and please like and follow our YouTube channel and check out our website at www.humanitynow.world. Thank you, Babak, and I hope you have a great evening.
Thank you for having me. Have a great evening.